Hello there. Thank you for joining me for this very first episode on the channel. In this first video, I want to dive straight into a fascinating question: the very nature of consciousness. But before we begin, I want to be clear about what I mean by the word consciousness. When I talk about consciousness, I am not referring to brain processes. I am not talking about memories, personality, or intelligence. I am also not talking about the mechanism that produces a sensation, but about the experience itself of feeling that sensation. If you remove memory, thoughts, and personality, what remains is something more fundamental: the simple fact of being aware. You know that quiet sense of being, the feeling that you are even before any thought appears? That's the consciousness I am referring to, the raw experience of existing. When you look at it that way, there are really only two possibilities. Either this experience is individual, tied to each person, or it's universal, one single consciousness shared by everything. Everything else basically comes down to one of those two. Personally, I find that the universal view makes the most sense, even if it doesn't feel natural to think that way. In this video, I will share the reasons why I believe there is only one consciousness shared by everyone. But before that, let's first explore the opposite view. Materialists and dualists are among the strongest defenders of the idea that consciousness is individual. For materialists, the logic is simple. Consciousness is a product of the brain, the result of physical processes, neurons, and biochemistry. Since each organism has its own distinct brain, each one produces its own subjective experience. Therefore, consciousness must be individual, tied to the specific material of each body. But for me, the very foundation of materialism goes against what subjective experience actually is. Because even if the brain influences access to consciousness, that doesn't explain why there is an inner experience at all. Describing mechanisms through biochemistry, neurons, and hormones is useful, but it doesn't tell us why there is something it feels like to be, rather than nothing. Materialists can explain the easy problems of consciousness, like why we behave one way rather than the other, or how the brain stores memory, and so on. However, when it comes to their hard problem, like how the brain generates subjective experience, then they just hit a wall. It's like trying to explain the scenes of a movie by studying a screen. Even if you understand everything about optics, electronics, and every technical detail about screens, you still would not understand the movie itself or how its events unfold. That is because the source of the images lies elsewhere. So, even if materialists had complete knowledge of the brain, they could never explain where subjective experience truly comes from. For me, this core of presence is undeniable, and it cannot be reduced to mere biological computation. Some radical materialists go even further and claim that consciousness itself is an illusion, just a byproduct of the brain. Remove memory, emotions, perceptions, and nothing remains. At least that's what they think. What we call pure consciousness, they say, is just an illusion. They often cite anesthesia as proof. Under anesthesia, consciousness disappears, so it cannot exist independently of matter. Well, the problem with that reasoning is that it treats consciousness as something observable. However, in reality, subjective experience can exist even when it is not observable from the outside. The brain is merely an interface to consciousness, and when it is under anesthesia, that link is disrupted. Just like a screen that is turned off can no longer display a movie, even though the movie still exists, but not on the screen. Dualists, who I find less extreme than materialists, believe that consciousness exists independently of matter. This is the view found in the Abrahamic religions like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, though, as we will see later, some mystical branches of these religions hold non-dual beliefs. Dualists believe in two fundamental substances, matter and spirit, Each person, they say, possesses their own spirit. So for dualists, my consciousness is mine, yours is yours, and even God's would be his own. The issue with this view is that it confuses two levels of consciousness. It mixes cognitive consciousness, that includes sensations and memory, which indeed vary from person to person, with fundamental consciousness, or the level of pure experience. And there's no evidence that this fundamental consciousness is multiple. The diversity of experiences doesn't prove that consciousness itself is divided. Let's now look at why that's the case. Since the dawn of humanity, countless religions and spiritual traditions have spoken of a single, universal consciousness. In Eastern traditions like Buddhism, Taoism, or Advaita Vedanta within Hinduism, this idea is central. Everything is one. The consciousness that perceives through us is the same infinite and indivisible consciousness. Even in religions that seem dualistic, we find in their mystical branches the same intuition of unity. Sufism in Islam, Christian mysticism, and the Jewish Kabbalah all speak in their own ways of a single spirit behind the apparent multiplicity. Those who have experienced enlightenment describe the same thing: the dissolution of the ego, the end of separation, and the realization that the only thing that truly exists is consciousness itself. Even people who have explored their psyche through psychedelic experiences report the same insight. There is only one consciousness, and the ego, the sense of being a separate entity, is just an illusion. Many describe reaching a state where the self disappears, and what remains is pure, universal consciousness. I can already see some of you thinking, okay, that's poetic, but these are just stories. Nothing actually proves it's real. And you're right. So let's go further. Let's imagine for a moment that multiple separate consciousnesses exist. For them to be distinct, there would need to be something that differentiates them, some way to perceive that difference. But for that difference to be perceived, it must appear within a shared consciousness. So the very idea of multiple consciousnesses already presupposes the existence of one overarching consciousness. It's a paradox. All separations we believe to be real exist within a single field of awareness, like waves forming on the surface of the ocean. They appear different, but they never stop being water. Consciousness manifests in countless forms, yet remains one and indivisible. Before wrapping up, let me share an analogy. Imagine an AI app, let's say ChatGPT, for example. When you use it on your phone, you might think it exists in your device. You type, you talk, and it responds. But in reality, ChatGPT isn't in your phone. It lives on distant servers. Your phone is just a gateway, a sort of interface. I see consciousness in a similar way. When I experience the world through my eyes, ears, and hands, I feel like the essence of me, my true self, lives elsewhere, and that my body is merely a tool to interact with this world. What I truly am is not trapped inside my body. My body is just an interface. The essence of who I am might exist in another invisible dimension. And there's another interesting part of this analogy. Every user of ChatGPT has a slightly different experience. Depending on the person, the context, or the memory of the system, on each phone, ChatGPT can seem to have a slightly different personality. That makes me think of us. Maybe our consciousness comes from a shared source, but it takes on a unique color through our memories and personal experiences. That's what makes each of us unique. For consciousness to be truly universal, it cannot be identified with material entities, which are separate and isolated from one another. Each individual body is limited and distinct, so matter itself cannot carry a single universal awareness. By its very nature, universal consciousness transcends materiality and expresses itself through beings, rather than being contained within them.